Hi, I'm Chris Collins and I'm Horticultural Director of Vegetableseeds.net. And I know you love to send in questions to us, so I'm here to answer all your queries. Right, my first question is from Mr. Robert Hand, and he asked, the last season I attempted to grow runner beans, a runner bean called White Lady, in my greenhouse. And he had a very successful season in 2010. There were loads of flowers, plenty of insects. But unfortunately, this year, he's had trouble with pod drop. What I'd call pod drop means that the fruit is starting to form, but it's actually suddenly falling off the plant before it ripens. And he would love to find out what's causing this. Now, I'm not there, obviously, to see how often you're watering, Robert, but usually any kind of sudden drop is down to two reasons. One is erratic irrigation, which means if you're letting the beans dry out, they'll drop their pods. Beans don't like having dry feet, so maybe a little bit more attention to your watering. If you don't think that's the case and you think you're watering okay, I think you need to look at maybe any drafts or heat sources or anything that will cause a sudden change of temperature in the environment could also lead to pod drop. Hope that answers your question. So my second question is from Susan and John, who are actually Vegetableseeds.net bloggers with a blog called Living Off the Land. Thanks for your question. They've been growing a snowball turnip and they've been leaving them in the ground. Apparently we're told that when they're lifted they don't last that long, so they've been leaving them in the ground and lifting them as they need to eat them, and apparently they're very delicious. They've now started to notice that the turnips are starting to rot in the ground and that they're exuding a white pus, and they want to know what that problem is. Well, I would think that actually the turnips have been in the ground too long, and I don't know what the white pus is, but I should imagine it's related to rotting. It sounds very much like that. So the answer to this is lift them, and I want you to build a thing called a huggy, right? You see these up north. I saw the first one I saw was on an allotment site in Stoke, which is basically a barrel or maybe a crate full of sand, preferably silver sand. And you can stick your turnips and your carrots and your parsnips into that, bury them in, and that will actually act like a freezer and keep them all winter long. So build yourself one of those, very simple to build, crate or barrel, make sure it can drain, silver sand, bury your root vegetables in there, and they will last perfectly. Right, my next question is from Sarah, who calls herself the Elmdon Hippie. Thanks for your question, Sarah. And she's written to me about broad beans. She's tried growing aqua dulce and imperial green long pods in chicken manure-enriched soil, 8 to 10 plants about 6 inches apart in a sheltered spot. But she only gets 2 or 3 servings, and the pods tend to be very spindly and underdeveloped and can turn brown. She's asked me what's happened to her crop. Well, it's important to remember, actually, Sarah, that beans are very hungry and thirsty creatures. They need quite a lot of attention. And I'd give an advantage to them when I first plant them is before I even put them in the ground, I'd dig a trench and I'd take the soil out of that trench, and in the bottom of that trench I'd lay some newspaper, and I'd also put some fish blood and bone or bone meal or natural organic fertiliser into the bottom of that trench. I'd then take my soil from the trench and mix it with some well-rotted horse manure and put that back. Now that does two things. One is it feeds the plants a lot, but also it helps retain moisture around the roots of the bean. They don't like dry feet. They love to have wet feet. So that gives them a really kick-off start. The other thing I'd probably do is I'd give them a liquid feed over a seaweed extract, something like that. I'd apply that early in the morning when the stomata are open and the plant's breathing, and that will do that every 2 weeks, and the bean will soak that up straight into the vascular bundle, and that will give them a boost as well. Remember to keep the irrigation regular as well. So with regular water, regular feeding, and a really good trench full of OM and newspapers to retain the moisture, hopefully your beans will get a strong start. If they are spindly and they're going a bit brown, I would say maybe lack of moisture, or also be careful how windy and how breezy the site is. They will need a little bit of shelter. I hope that answers your question, Sarah. Now my next question brought a chuckle to my face. This is from Vale Sandbridge in Hertfordshire, and she says all the brassicas she grows, that's her cabbages and broccoli, seem to suffer badly from whitefly. Even the weeds have whitefly, she says. Well, for a start, there shouldn't be any weeds there, should there? Because they might actually be hosting your whitefly and causing your brassicas problems. But she says, how do I get rid of them? Well, answer one is make sure you weed, make sure you keep your site clean and hygienic. Always weed before they seed, because if you don't let them seed, then you're going to have more weed. So get the weeds out quickly, hoe them out. Whitefly are quite easy to control. You can put a little bit of soapy water into a sprayer, a water sprayer. That will check them, no problem. Or the other thing you can do is you can put up glue pads, which is like a yellow card you can get in a garden centre, on a piece of bamboo, and that's got glue on, and that just sticks the whitefly to it. Also try and encourage a bit of ladybird into the area, because they'll chomp on the whitefly. If you're indoors, there's actually a parasitic wasp called Encarsia famosa, which actually feeds on whitefly. So actually I wouldn't worry overly about whitefly. I'd be more worried about the sooty mould they produce, because they can encourage fungus as well. Keep your site hygienic, bit of soapy water, maybe some glue cards. I'm sure your brassicas will be fine. Now my next question is from Charlie, and she sounds like she's been battling with some rather big raspberry bushes. They've been away from the home a bit, and they've got to 15 feet long. It doesn't surprise me because raspberry are pretty vigorous plants. She's been hacking into them, and she's just wondering, does she need to cut them down anymore, prune them anymore? Well, it can be really hard with raspberry bushes, and what I would suggest, Charlie, is anything that's maybe 2 years old, stem-wise, or older, I'd cut right down to the ground, get rid of. And what you need to do is, for each plant, pick maybe 4 or 5 young, vigorous, fresh shoots. Maybe from 1 season old, 2 season old tops. Get the whole plant out, cut it all down apart from those stems, because they'll then start producing your raspberries the following season. So really underlying my advice is get nice young French stems, retain them, and don't be afraid to have a real old hack at them. They're tough plants. Well, I have a further question from our bloggers, Living Off the Land bloggers, Susan and John. And this time they've written to me about to water or not to water. They said they've had trouble with water. They live in Norfolk, which is, I know, been very dry the last couple of seasons. And they've got the dilemma of, do they go out and water all the time? Do they leave their planting to later in the season? It's very, very quite a taxing question, because do you let nature do its stuff, or do you intervene, and the work that entails? Well, to start with, really, if you're going to grow veg, there's no way you can avoid irrigation. It's fundamental to the growing of vegetables. Think of a potato, a carrot, a parsnip, they are 90% water. Yeah, things like beans, peas will not take drought conditions, so you need to water. So you need to set up a system. I'd use a water butts wherever I could. Make sure you don't use that for seedlings though. Make sure you use tepid water on young plants. So there's no real shortcut not to watering, and also if you don't water and you're sowing seed, it leads to patchy germination and low yields. Now, wild plants do well because they're adapted to their situation. Weeds do well because they're adapted, they're very adaptable plants, and they will see out and be more vigorous in environments that other plants will suffer in. So I'm afraid in a little way your vegetables, they need a bit more pampering, they're a bit more thievery. So you're going to need to definitely keep an eye on irrigation. There are ways you can help yourself with this. You can make sure you water early in the morning or last thing at night, straight to the base of the plants. It's direct watering, you're not getting any waste through transpiration or loss. The other thing you can do is a mulch. Really, a mulch is a brilliant way to preserve water. Nice, thick, organic mulch. I know you're composting. Get that on. You might already be doing that, but again, that will help preserve. If you want to start your plants more vigorously and you're worried about sowing straight in the ground, why not, in your greenhouse, get your plants. You can't really do it with root parsnips and carrots, but the other stuff, get your plants started in a propagator, in a greenhouse, get them up, grow them on, give them a nice early start so they're quite vigorous and tough before you transplant them in the ground, and then they're not so vulnerable to lack of irrigation. My next question is from Mercedes and Andy, and they're asking me about celery, which is an interesting one because I've not been a big grower of celery, but I know a little bit about it. It's not the easiest of crop. And they're wondering what to do as the celery begins to happen, and it's thinning and they're not getting many stems on it. Well, the art of celery growing, to be honest with you, is to do a thing called earthing up. What's happening is your celery is becoming spindly. This is my educated guess anyway. It's becoming spindly as it's growing, and it's competing, and it etiolates, a thing called etiolating, which means it stretches for the light. A way to avoid that is, as the celery starts to grow, is just take the soil from around it and earth up. This is a traditional way of doing it. Earth up, and this will keep the stems really rigid and stiff, and then later on you can pull them and cut them and they'll be quite strong. That's one way of doing it. That's quite the traditional way of doing it. They call it blanching. There are actually varieties on the market that self-blanch. Also, maybe pay attention to your spacing. They might be a bit close together. I would have celery good 30 centimetres apart or thereabouts. Maybe a bit of homework there for you to do. As I say, I've not grown a lot of celery myself. Another issue is raspberries. One day they're nice and healthy looking, and the next day before ripening, you're just going to go and pick them, and they're all mushy and they fade colour and they drop on the floor. It's a bit unfortunate, isn't it, really? Well, I think that this is probably a mildew problem. Some sort of mildew or fungus is attacking them. It probably means that your stems are a bit overcrowded. You might need to thin them a bit. Think of plants of any description, especially these ones, as a living being, and like a person, like me and you, we need space to breathe and move and take in the elements like oxygen and carbon dioxide. So if a plant is very dense and overcrowded and the stems are crossing, etc., then that plant's more vulnerable to fungus and disease because it's just crowded. So if you cut out any dead disease or dying wood, keep the vigorous young shoots and cut out the old ones, there's more air moving around that plant, there's less chance of mildews and funguses. It also might be a case that wherever they're growing, the air's quite still. So you might find that as well. You can spray with a copper fungicide. I don't recommend it if you're going to weed, but just keep the plant open and spacey and fresh and make sure it's getting air. My next question is from Phil Nicholson, who's north of the border in Kirkley Allotments in Glasgow. Fine city, Phil. And he's asking me about the cold summers in Scotland. Yes, I used to live across in the east coast, and yeah, I know how cold it can be up there. And he says, my spuds and broad beans, Imperial Green Long Pod, did quite well, but the French bean, both climbing and dwarf, virtually refused to grow. Have any others had a similar experience? More importantly, can anyone recommend a variety of bean other than broad beans that would do well in the cold northern summers? Well, to be honest with you, if you're having trouble with broad beans and runner beans up there, then there's not real great you can do about it if they're reacting to the fact that it's so cool up there. What I would recommend is, I'm not sure if you're doing this, but I would grow them under some sort of protection, a polytunnel maybe, just so you get a bit more warmth around them in the air. So a polytunnel, maybe you can build a bigger cloche. There are various things you can buy in garden centres to give them some sort of protection and see if that makes a difference.